It's turning America into a plague state, could not manage its pandemic, worst pandemic record of any country in the world. There's a very important characteristic of the former colonies, which is that they were founded on genocide. I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't any mass murders going on in Europe. It was absolute mayhem for many of the centuries of medieval Europe. But in Canada, I sense this particularly because we live in a country which was founded on, essentially, if not the cultural, if not the material genocide, at least the cultural genocide of the native people who lived here. Now, let me give you an example of this, and then I'll go on to America. I live in Winnipeg, right at the center of Canada. It's got a very radical tradition. It was the site of a rebellion led by a man called Louis Riel, who was the leader of the Métis people, which is people who had resulted from the intermarriage of French colonialists and the native people there. And he fought for an independent nation of the Métis, and he was defeated by the British in a war, as is the way these people go. The heritage of that foundation of Winnipeg is still there. So our water, all the water of Winnipeg comes from a place called Shoal Lake, which is a few hundred kilometers away. The people who live in Shoal Lake do not have clean water. I mean, they are on what's called boil water advisories. The water is so unreliable so the people who are supplying this city with its water do not themselves get water. The electricity, which they praise as being so-called green because it's hydroelectric, comes from up north. And I've traveled, I've visited, I've spoken to the people, the elders, and heard what's going on. It's not clean at all because the hydroelectric power is being used as a source of money. It's exported to North America. And it's actually a state-owned corporation. It is a corporation. It behaves in every sense like a private corporation. It doesn't have public interest at stake. It is destroying the natural habitat of the North because you build the water up when it should be going down, and you let the water down when it should be going up. So it's had a terrifically destructive effect on the peoples there. In Winnipeg, people just don't see it. All they see is poor Indigenous people and think that that's because they're inferior. So it kindles that racism. And it's only recently that there has been the discovery that in the residential schools, you may have heard the residential schools, there was an attempt made to essentially eliminate, this is why it's called cultural genocide, it's actually pretty damn material, eliminate the existence of an independent Indigenous population by taking the children away and putting them in schools essentially run by religious authorities. And these were, because these authorities were then left completely free and unregulated to do whatever they wanted. Certainly they were not under the control of the people they were educating, or the kids they were educating. There was physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, every conceivable kind of abuse that you can think of. Now, the Indigenous people have been saying for many, many decades that the children were being killed and that there were mass graves. And until 1996, nobody even credited this when the truth and finally the residential schools were wound up in 1996. So there's this tremendous denial. This cannot be happening. We're a civilized power. We are the apogee of world civilization. This can't happen under us, but it was. And it wasn't until Indigenous organizations became able to use advanced technology that they disclosed that there were, in fact, mass graves in residential schools. And this is only really being investigated now, thanks to the resistance of and insistence of the Indigenous population. Now, why is that important? Because in some sense of the Canadians, it's utterly false, that somehow they're superior to the Americans because they didn't have slavery. Well, you have genocide and you don't have slavery. It's not such a big recommendation. You have the super exploitation of the reserves and the peoples of the lands that you conquered. It's not such a good thing. You're raping and destroying the old growth forests of Canada. You're digging up the tar sands in Alberta and forcing people to carry oil through pipelines against the resistance again of the indigenous people whose land you're invading. It's not that good. But when you get to America, they also do have the legacy of slavery. And the legacy of slavery is this tremendous unaddressed racism in America. And what I think that produces is it is actually the basis for Trumpism and incipient fascism in America, because people who are actually very poor white people, believe that because they're superior to poor black people, who are their equals materially, therefore their interest lies in siding with their own wealthy, rich class. They think, Trump must be a great guy because he's got so much money. He stole all of it, but he must be a great guy. So they think they have more in common with Donald Trump than they do with George Floyd. I think what happened as a result of the growth of inequality in America, which has been going on for decades now through the abandonment of the welfare state, or such welfare state as they had, is that ordinary white people, particularly white youth, began to realize they had more in common with black people than they did with Donald Trump. So inequality in America has had two contradictory effects. On the one hand, it's the source of American racism, it's the origin of American racism. But on the other hand, it is creating the basis for a genuine identity of the working class, properly defined, which includes everybody, whether they're employed or not, includes women, even if they're deprived of the right to employment, employs everybody on the streets and so on. So I think what that inequality is producing in America is a sense of resistance and incipient unity against what the American elites are doing. But it's very small, very initial. The main outcome of that is Trumpism. The main outcome of that is somebody who actually, he waged a fascist coup. That's what he did. And I think that the threat of that is not over. That was just a rehearsal, which is why there's so much difficulty now in prosecuting the people who are leaders of that insurrection. So the most dangerous consequence of inequality is not just, there's a few poor people in the street, give them some money, throw them a dime or two. It's destroying the fabric of American society, and it's turning America into a plague state that could not manage its pandemic, the worst pandemic record of any country in the world, that is destroying the climate and leads the resistance to any effective measures against climate change in the world, and which is becoming the most militarily aggressive power by far in the world. So the effects of inequality go far beyond just a few poor people. I think that would be my answer.